I first met Rebecca in Steve's and Kate's bookstore long ago when I think she was at the Mesa Refuge, and she came down to read, and I was there for two purposes. First of all, to hear her, and I can't remember exactly what she said, and secondly, to run up afterwards before anyone got to her and get the email address for Mark Klett. And from that email address, a book that we collaborated on, Rebecca and I and Mark Klett, this wonderful landscape photographer, After the Ruins, was born. So it was an opportunist meeting. Subsequent meetings have been much more along the lines of my learning from her and her learning a little bit from me. But as you'll see, she'll soon take over, and her mind goes clickety-click in the fastest manner that I can think of. I have to read this because I need to get it right. I think Rebecca is one of the most far-ranging, versatile in terms of subject matter and non-fiction genres, and well-read writers working in this country today. And that's at a point that I think is somewhere below what I could say, but I sort of restrain myself. I mean, she has an incredible mind, and if you sit with her, as we did at dinner, or if you walk with her on the streets of San Francisco, as we did when we put this book together, that mind goes clickety-click in this incredible fashion that brings all these facts, these books that she's read, and brings them together and spews them out in a manner that makes incredible sense, if you can keep up with her. So I have a lot more written here, which I could tell you about. The only other thing I'll tell you about is the one romantic encounter that Rebecca and I had. And it didn't result in a child, as you might think, or anything else that might come immediately to your mind. Although I'm going to string this out a little bit so your imaginations can work. It resulted in the marriage of Marina Citron, Rebecca's friend, to my son Alex Fradkin. And they're here today, and that relationship and marriage, I don't know if it was a relationship, but certainly the marriage was consummated in Mesa Retreat, which Peter Barnes runs. And if any of the rest of you want to be fixed up, Rebecca and I are in the business of matchmakers.
And if you just need a little public embarrassment, Philip can handle that for you too. But, actually, I think I had a wonderful Mesa Refuge month, what seemed like a month. It was only 2 weeks, a month in a good sense, where I got a lot of really great writing done earlier in the decade, which is how I was able to recommend Marina, who needed a ride to Mesa Refuge. So you can see the instrumentality of Mesa Refuge in various lives.
So I'll start with one question, and then you probably won't hear from me again. There's no such thing as a natural disaster. Is that true, Rebecca?
Yes. Did you want me to say more, Philip?
Yes.
It's funny, I just came back from the LA Book Fair. I left early to be here, and I was on a panel about Haiti, and they had an earthquake in Haiti about the same size as the Loma Prieta, except that they now think maybe 300,000 people died instead of 200,000. And the interesting thing about earthquakes, in particular among natural disasters, is that nobody dies of an earthquake. You die of the architecture that falls on you in an earthquake. And Philip actually knows more about earthquakes than me by far. Is there any account of people, in open space being injured in any way that you know of?
In 1906, I think there was 2 deaths in West Marin. One person was in a stone cottage up in Tamales, and I can't remember the other one. But a lot of people were shaken and rattled and rolled, and I think that's the best proof that I can give you. It's the structures.
Yeah, it's architecture that falls on you. And then also a lot of disasters. So, earthquakes in particular are particular brand of natural disasters, really about the architecture. I was in L'Aquila, Italy, where they had a medium-sized earthquake, but in which a number of people died, partly because they have medieval and Renaissance masonry architecture, long before building codes, but also because the building codes aren't that great and the corruption is pretty high. And somebody said to me when I was at this disaster site in October, in California nobody would have died, and which is really about how much it depends on the human intervention. In Cuba, everybody is safely evacuated from the site from the coast when a hurricane approaches, and they have 0 casualties in the evacuation, 0 casualties in the hurricanes generally. Whereas you look at Hurricane Katrina, where we had about 1,600, and we have had similar casualties. So it's really, disasters are social. It really depends on what kind of society you have beforehand in terms of social solidarity and structures, what kind of a response you have afterwards. And my book, A Paradise Built in Hell, a lot of it is about the remarkable way ordinary people respond, which is often sort of spun out as the sugary, we all rise to the occasion. But the other part of it is about the way that institutional authorities often make disasters far, far worse. And what I didn't really realize until I went through it for myself, that Philip kind of nails them, but it's even worse, is the extent to which the U.S. Army burnt down San Francisco after the 1906 earthquake, and treated the citizens like enemies, and essentially there's a hostile occupation of the city. So like Hurricane Katrina, you had one disaster that was sort of natural, and then you had one that was entirely social and at the hands of the authorities.
I'd like to sort of clarify what I said. I think there's two ways that you can say that there's no such thing as a natural disaster. And the first is we put ourselves in the way of disasters. In 1982, we built homes at the mouth of creeks that disgorged incredible amounts of mud and silt. In Inverness, in 1906, we built structures on the San Andreas Fault. In 1995, we honeycombed the top of Inverness Ridge with homes, many of which burnt to the ground. So, the way I look at natural disasters, I think we put ourselves there. But the way that Rebecca has written about it, in A Paradise Built in Hell, it's what happens afterwards, that the human quotient, the elites, who's ever in power comes in and multiplies the first effect to make a much worse disaster. And maybe, Rebecca, you could go into that a little bit more deeply in terms of New Orleans and any of the other four places that you look at, because it really what happens afterwards in terms of, quote unquote, the authorities that make it much worse.
Yeah, you can ask yourself what would have happened with a number of the big American disasters, for example, if there had been different people in power, people who, in a lot of cases, nothing would have been better than what they did. And in the first hours after the earthquake, and Philip's wonderful book on the 2006 earthquake, I leaned on a lot and quoted for my 1906 section. But the commander of the U.S. military in the Presidio wasn't around, and so the assistant commander, this horrid man we've foolishly named things after, Frederick Funston, as in Fort Funston and the headlands and things like that, marched all his troops in. He assumed, as people often assume, people who've seen too many Hollywood disaster movies or who are just generally suspicious of their fellow human beings, that people were going to revert to some kind of Hobbesian social Darwinist marauding, rioting, looting, that people were just going to run wild. And what's interesting about this is this assumption's made over and over. It was made by the media in Haiti this year. It was made in 1906. It's been made countless times. This assumption is that human beings are basically savage and basically selfish and competitive, and what holds us in check is the state and the implicit and explicit threat of violence of the state, threat that becomes much more explicit in the aftermath of a disaster. And what actually happens in disaster is that most people actually behave with generosity, with creativity, with altruism, with solidarity, and improvise these often very moving and beautiful responses in which a lot of people taste a kind of sense of community, of purposefulness, of immediacy, of agency, of voice that they're missing in everyday life, which is a reminder of what a disaster everyday life is. So people often, and this is what prompted the project for me, is I saw that joy lighting up people's faces when they talked about the Loma Prieta quake and even the Oakland Hills fire and all kinds of other disasters. And I was really intrigued by it, and I began to investigate it. And in the subject, I felt like I had thought I was walking into an interesting room, and I was walking into an interesting continent, and then the subject just getting bigger and bigger till it ended up being this kind of proving grounds for a lot of ideas about human nature. So that's what mostly happens in disaster. But the authorities assume the worst about us, and it's why, for example, it's very ordinary in disasters. It happened in Haiti, it happened in New Orleans, to mete out the death penalty for minor property crimes. Most of you probably don't believe that somebody should be shot without benefit of trial for stealing, a television or a loaf of bread or some powdered milk or something like that. But that routinely happens in disaster. The media endorses it. It's portrayed, we use this sort of magical word looting, which he's like, waving a red flag in front of a bull was supposed to be, we won't get into bulls since I know there's probably a lot of experts here. And speaking of country arts and lectures. But, it's an incendiary word, and it conflates the very legitimate foraging that happens in a landscape without an economy where you can't buy things because nobody's selling them, there's no money, there's no banks, there's no storekeepers, there's no business, there's no electricity, credit cards are meaningless, etc. With, theft, but that's still, we just don't, we don't have the death penalty for theft in this country much. And, and crazy stuff happens. One thing I got very involved in New Orleans is that for some reason the media couldn't or wouldn't see the story of what had gone on the other side of the river from the city of New Orleans, that's still the parish of New Orleans, which is that a group of white vigilantes had so worked themselves up, either, depending on which one of them you listen to, an exciting opportunity to have a race war or genuine fear that the marauding hordes were going to come and rape their grandmothers, that they began shooting black men, and they appear to have murdered several men. The best witness is this person I got close to named Donnell Harrington, who was actually a Brinks truck driver, and people are usually, who drive, $500,000 of cash around for a living aren't really that interested in stealing your TV when they're evacuating with what they can carry. But they shot him point blank with a shotgun twice on the grounds that all black men were looters. And if they showed up in the neighborhood, even though you had to walk through there to evacuate on the boats they had sent to take people out of the region. So you see this is kind of what Philip, I think, is referring to as this second wave of disaster. People responding with a special kind of savagery, a savagery that assumes, since you're going to come and steal my goods or assault me, I'm going to shoot you before you can. And in fact, you were actually doing something completely different, but I've just shot you. And so, so the assumption of these people, including the authorities, is that you guys are the monsters that I'm controlling, but in fact, they're the monsters who are out of control often in disasters. So that's one of the social layers of disaster that that doesn't have to happen. And earthquakes and hurricanes will happen regardless of what we do. But how we prepare for them and how we respond to them is something that's wide open and in many, many, many cases could be done profoundly differently.
What I'd like you to do is think about the disasters that you've been in, maybe in West Marin and other places, and bring your own personal memories to bear on what Rebecca has been saying when we come to the question period. I think Rebecca's greatest contribution to this country, and people east of the Hudson River don't really recognize us out here, and she deserves a lot more recognition that she's gotten, and she's gotten a lot, and I hope she gets a lot more. She brings a fresh way of looking at things, and you may or may not agree with it, but it's so fresh and so well thought out and so well documented, both in terms of history, both in terms of memoir, both in terms of journalism, that you can't say no to it. You have to consider it. And the contribution of this book is the altruism, the moment of joy, the sense of community that a disaster brings forth in people. And I'd like Rebecca to speak a little bit about that in terms of Loma Prieta, which she experienced, and also in terms of Halifax and the huge explosion that happened there, and also in terms of New York City and 9/11, where you might not think that occurred, but that Rebecca very revealingly has written about.
That's a lot. We'll see how much ground I cover before I run out of steam. But yeah, I think. How many of you were in the Loma Prieta earthquake in 1989? Wow, some of you weren't. Somehow I sort of thought everybody might have been here 21 years ago. But I was actually sitting at home writing a sentence about the Kennedy assassination when everything started shaking, and I'm proud to say my first impulse was to hit save. The kind of long-distance focus that's the source of a lot of our dissatisfactions, did I have a terrible childhood? What am I going to do about my retirement? These kind of distant things disappeared, and you're in this very intensified present where you care deeply about the people around you. You have something in common because you've gone through the same experience. There's a lot of urgent things to do. For most of us, it wasn't that extreme. I know the power was out for 24 hours in my neighborhood. It was out for 3 days in North Beach in San Francisco. But it was just a profound shift in focus, and a lot of people, even recently I talk with incredible joy. I met a woman in North Beach who talked about how the bars, these candlelit bars became the kind of community centers where everybody checked in, and this often happens. It happens in the blackouts in New York City and stuff, where the food will all go bad, so the restaurants start cooking it up and giving it away on the sidewalk. So you suddenly have this kind of fiesta atmosphere. And I think the Loma Prieta, we're very lucky because of the long-term social, priorities, and the fact that we're not so corrupt in our building out here and stuff, and that only 60 people died, which, is 60 tragedies and 60 too many, but it's still, when you look at a lot of other earthquakes of that scale, the deaths are in the thousands to tens and hundreds of thousands. So, but another person told me that he had to drive home on surface streets from Candlestick Park. He'd been at the World Series game home to near Golden Gate Park. At every single intersection, somebody was out there directing traffic, not because there was a top-down authority that told them, but just because they thought that there was a need and they could fill it. And he was still kind of awestruck and overjoyed by just the sense of people, taking charge of their society and making it work in this very fundamental way that I think is very empowering for them. It's not an experience we often have of being urgent, necessary, and having these basic and meaningful tasks. I found a wonderful essay by a writer I quoted in the book, Stephen Doheny Farina, who talks about the big ice storm. I forget if it was late in the last decade or early in this, or actually we're in a whole new decade. If it was early in this millennium or in the previous, the decade before. But he's a teacher, and teaching is meaningful and important and necessary, but suddenly he wasn't a teacher anymore. He's the guy who kept the generator running so that nobody froze to death in his little collective. I think a bunch of the neighbors all moved into one house and kept everything going. And the immediacy of that, he didn't want it to let it go and go back to this kind of job with the more remote and distant goals that most of us have in our everyday lives. So there's that kind of immediacy and satisfaction and connection and purposefulness that people don't always have in everyday life. Although I think a lot of us do meaningful and important work, and it's about the kind of discipline of paying attention, just like I think making that sense of solidarity and community and non-attachment to material things and awareness of mortality and these things that are very much sort of Buddhist principles. And disaster can be a crash course in Buddhism. But it's like you get shaken awake, as one of the metaphors I use, that suddenly you're awake in a way that you're not before, and it's profound. But, then you fall asleep again. The point is not to get shaken awake. The point is not that disasters are good because they're terrible. The point is, what can you learn from them about who we could be, what we desire to be? This deep joy for me is so indicative of what's missing from everyday life, from these deep desires people have to be not just members of relationships and families, the private self that we're told about all the time in a kind of therapy culture, a privatized culture, but people want to be members of communities. They want to participate in public life. They want voice and agency. They want to be members of civil society, which is a desire so profound that even when you're surrounded by death and disarray and the destruction of all the familiar, there's often this intense joy. That was the most unspeakable thing about 9/11, is that I think in a way that we don't even have words for, people were having if I say a good time, we think of good time as like happy, light, cheerful, sunny, but I think they were having a deeply meaningful time, which is a better thing than a good time, something we crave more than a good time. And they felt connected, they felt urgent. Suddenly there was this enormous intellectual curiosity about our foreign policy, about the Muslim world. There was enormous altruism, and I did the math, and half the Olympic swimming pool full of blood was donated that first week. So many people wanted to give blood even though it wasn't needed, which was this deep desire to give the most essential, to give something of their own life. And people, had that kind of selflessness and deep awareness of other people's lives and deep empathy that they don't necessarily have every day. And they felt better living that way than being totally selfish and being able to catch up on all the latest trivia and consumer products that's supposed to be the American diet. So I'm not going to cover all the disasters, but for me that's the essence of the really good stuff that happens. I probably said enough about institutional misbehavior.
Okay, let's talk about some of the bad stuff. I read your book, and And having
That's
talked to you
good.
before you wrote it, I had a sense of what you were writing about. And what you're writing about is true, but I take some issue with it. And that is...
Shocked to hear it.
It's lucky I don't hear well. Or I hear selectively.
Nobody said this would be easy, Philip. That's why they picked you.
Okay, so I've been through our own disasters. A house lost on the hill up here. As a journalist, I've been on the streets of Los Angeles and Chicago during urban riots, and in Southeast Asia during a war, and in the Ambassador Hotel when Robert Kennedy got shot. And yes, there is a momentary moment of people coming together. But to me, and you do touch on this, but fleetingly, really, it's fear is the dominant emotion.
But those aren't natural disasters. That's an assassination, a war, and a sort of civil war writ small. And when your home burned down, I think William James addresses that beautifully in A Paradise Built in Hell, where he says it's the loneliness of our ordinary tragedies. I'm getting it wrong. Actually, I could probably find it, but
Nope.
he says, nope. Could somebody bring me a book from over there?
No, don't.
Who are you going to listen to?
Yeah, the line starts here.
A copy of A Paradise Built in Hell. But William James actually says very beautifully that it's see, now I get it. Oh, it's a library book.
Sorry, Steve.
When your house burns down, you're just...
She put him in the...
Since I picked on him first, I started it. It's true. It's true. So I now fully know what I've always believed, that no, this is a slightly different thing, but okay. This could take a minute, so maybe we won't do it. It's really beautiful. Okay. Surely the cutting edge of all our usual misfortunes comes out of their character of loneliness. When your house burns down, everybody else is just fine, and you've been cut out of that community of everybody who's doing just fine. But when the city burns down, suddenly you're in this strange new boat with a whole lot of people you suddenly have a lot in common with you might not have ever felt before. Which is why people are really different when the loss is collective and something like that. And disasters are essentially impersonal. The earthquake doesn't hate you and wish that your favorite politician was dead. The hurricane isn't inherently a racial divide, etc. And you're describing and this book is largely about natural disasters, although I included 9/11 in there because I think that it's a slippery slope. But I was looking at what the disaster sociologists called consensus crises, things where the trouble comes from outside and it unites the community to some extent. Although clearly New Orleans turned into a very divided disaster although it started out as a natural disaster because of the way people were treated. But they're very different than civil wars and urban unrest is specifically about the fact that, well, in this country that usually that African American people have been getting the shaft and they're really it's boiled over because they find it intolerable. So it's about schisms and cruelties that already exist in the culture that have suddenly risen to the surface and have to be addressed. So to me, those things are very different than what I was writing about. And in the same way that a lot of one of the weird things looking at some place like Haiti is that they've got 200 years of Haiti's sort of a continuous disaster because the majority of people there, since they started bringing African Americans in as slaves, have been incredibly impoverished, overworked, malnourished, and disenfranchised. And so when you look at something like the earthquake that just happened, it's a sudden disaster on top of centuries of disaster. But I was really interested in these sudden ruptures that in which none of the rules hold and people improvise a new social order. And so I think the Kennedy assassination is terrible, but all the systems are still working. And everything is still where it was an hour ago, in a sense that the phones work and bridges work and freeways work and everything's open for business, even though it's shocking. So I was really focusing on a very specific kind of experience that opened up, I think, this window on social possibility.
speaking of opening up a window on social possibility, I'd like to spend 2 more questions on the subject and then go back to some of your earlier books. My first question is, and I wrote about it in the 1906 book, or excuse me, a book called Magnitude 8, and then gave a very graphic example of what happened in 1906, which you did too. But then you took this on to the Mexico City earthquake and Bush losing his support after 9/11. And that is, and the Chinese knew about this 3,000 years ago, that regime change happens, or there's a change in the social and the political, especially the political order, after disasters. Could you speak about that?
Yeah. The Chinese called it the mandate of heaven, that they considered an earthquake to be a sign that the regime had lost the mandate of heaven, the mandate by which you were divinely entitled to rule. And it's I think in Chinese culture in some ways it wasn't even a surprise that Chairman Mao died a month after the huge Tanshan earthquake that we don't hear much about, that probably killed about 200,000 people in central China in 1976. It's, one of my peculiar missions I seem to have been sent on without my consent is to be the cheerful dissenting part of the left, from all the what I call the Eeyore chorus, at all the kind of it'll never work, we always lose, everything's getting worse. And there's a lot of ways in which Hurricane Katrina was terrible in its outcome. A lot of people lost a lot of things. New Orleans lost a lot of its vitality. But a lot of other really interesting things happened as well. One of the things that was remarkable is between Cindy Sheehan camping outside Bush's gates that summer and opening up a kind of wedge to criticize the war and the man himself directly, and exposing him for the chicken shit he was, that he couldn't walk, or drive in his little tricycle vehicle down the road and talk to this grieving mother and just get it over with. Instead, she laid siege to him for a month and for years afterwards. That happened that summer. I was actually at Camp Casey the day Hurricane Katrina hit. And then the way they mishandled Hurricane Katrina so outraged so many people that it made it possible to critique the Bush regime. It broke the 4 years of kind of lockstep, obedient intimidation that had been the norm for the media and the politicians in this country. The Democrats began to speak up, and within a year, it's a bit more than a year, 15 months later, took back the House. Keith Olbermann began his special comments, which, and actually Bush's own pollster said, it was the hurricane that did him in. Afterwards, he did a piece of Vanity Fair talked to him, and he agreed that Katrina brought the president down. And it's interesting, you see these things. The Mexico City earthquake in 1985 was really kind of the example of what disasters could be in the best sense, in that, which is not to say that I like disasters, but some really interesting things come out of them. It was a huge earthquake, and interestingly, like the Haitian earthquake that just happened, the buildings that collapsed were not the ancient colonial buildings, or necessarily the housing of the really poor people. It was a lot of this government-built housing from the past several decades. These big cement things that just pancaked hospitals were really hard hit, really tragic things like maternity wards. But the response of the Institutional Revolutionary Party, which had ruled Mexico, they'd had one party rule for 70 years, was so callous, so incompetent, and just so clueless, much like Bush and Katrina, that everybody in Mexico agrees that civil society was reborn. It was this moment where they realized that the state was, not only did they not like it or trust it, but it wasn't that competent. They were not the state. The state did not share interest with them. An independent Seamstresses Union was born because the Seamstresses had been really hard hit and were given no aid in getting their salaries and reparations and things like that. An incredible housing movement rose up around the city on the part of the poor, many of whom gained enormous rights. It's directly connected to the fact that Mexico City was able to soon gain the power to elect its mayors directly, and the collapse of the single-party state and the beginning of kind of normal electoral democracy, for better or worse, since it hasn't been that great. In fact, it seems almost certain that Cardenas, whose first name I can never pronounce, does anybody, Marina?
I mean, who was he to start with?
had been the mayor of Mexico City. He was the rival political candidate in 1988, and his father had been the best and most uncorrupt president of Mexico since, ever really. I think it was Diego Cardenas, but I can't remember either. The first one, I don't remember his name. The second one, his name is Aztec and has as many syllables as that volcano in Iceland, and is almost as hard to pronounce. It's like Coantohec or something. So he probably won the 1988 election, but in a famous phrase in Mexican history, the pre-announced La Sistema the system has crashed. They claimed that all the computers crashed. They did a manual count, and lo and behold, the pre-party candidate had won. But so the earthquake really begat a lot of solidarity and a lot of less tangible things than all these specific political victories. A different sense of self and society than existed before. And that can happen. I think the difference in Latin America, which has had some beautifully fruitful disasters in a weird way, like the 1972 terrible earthquake in Managua, but that really made the Sandinista victory inevitable because the Somoza regime behaved so badly. I think Latin Americans have a kind of romantic idealism, for starters, and then an ability to recognize and name and prize these experiences, that in a place like New York, New Yorkers had this experience that was so deeply anti-capitalist, so deeply uncompetitive, that was an experience of a completely different way of being in the world, a completely different way of relating to other human beings. In these days and hours and weeks when things were free, when people gave without measure, that, they could have said, maybe life could always be like this. I think a lot of Latin Americans had, and instead they're like, oh, let's just get Wall Street back up and running and return to, our particularly hideous economic system. And they did. Although there were some remarkable things, and one of the great things in New York, one of the sources of the stories of great joy, were these anarchist commissaries where people just assembled on the Chelsea piers and it started as like people giving away coffee and donuts and information. Within a couple of days, it had become this huge commissary, receiving goods from all over the region, dispatching them every 15 minutes on boats with bucket brigades, sort of transferring all the safety equipment, food, medical equipment, etc., to the boats. And it was like nobody was in charge, nobody was the boss, nobody ordered it. And it freaked the authorities out. It was this beautifully working system, but, they needed their version of control, and so they kind of like treated it like a criminal operation. And it was a black market operation, it says, but it was a black market operation for the benefit of all beings at ground zero. And they shut it down, and and then the Red Cross and the government began doing a much clumsier, less responsive version of that afterwards. But where were we, Philip?
One more question on disasters. One more question. We need to move fairly quickly. Okay. I wonder if anyone other than the Californian could have written about disasters and put them in such a pattern and derived such interesting results. I mean, I believe in landscape, meaning a lot of things compiled into one thing, determining who we are to a great extent. And maybe that's true of you, maybe it's not, but I just wonder if that gave you an edge on this subject.
I do feel like a Californian in a lot of ways that I'm very happy to talk about, but the direct answer to that question is a lot of my ideas came from the field of disaster sociology, and the founders of that field, I think Charles Fritz, who's really the godfather of disaster sociology, which are the people who were sent out during the Cold War to find out how people really behave in disasters. When our government was so fearful of us that there's actually language in the 1950s suggesting that American society posed a greater threat to itself than Soviet nuclear bombs did in the event of an all-out nuclear war. They're so afraid of how we would behave if they weren't controlling us that they actually suggested that American human nature was worse than Soviet thermonuclear weapons, which is a pretty profound statement. But Fritz went out, and he was the first sociologist to methodically do what the philosopher William James in the 1906 earthquake had said very informally, which is that people tend to be resourceful, calm, and more than altruistic, because to be even often sort of self-sacrificingly empathic and compassionate and sort of devoted. So, and his work has been buttressed by 60 years of disaster sociology, which has been headquartered in Ohio, Delaware, and Colorado for the national centers. So, I may have given it a California spin by being willing to take the ideas further in less careful ways than the disaster sociologists are willing to. They work very hard at being neutral and dispassionate and scientific and dealing with quantifiable effects, whereas I get to extrapolate and make political conclusions and connect it to big philosophical ideas and stuff, because that's the difference between a writer and a social scientist.
Okay. I'd like to move back to some of your earlier books quickly, because I'd like to give the audience time to ask questions. Savage Dreams. We've written about a number of similar topics. I wrote a book about nuclear fallout, and you wrote Savage Dreams, which deals half with the Nevada test site from where that fallout came in, the parallel between the Indians being kicked out of Yosemite National Park and in it, and you also wrote a book called "A Field Guide to Getting Lost," which I'd like to get to in a while. But
okay.
You mentioned this wonderful character named Everett Roos, and I'm now currently writing a biography of Everett Roos. So we have some parallels, and you say something in here which I'd like to hear you explore a little bit further, because it's certainly something I feel, and it's so far distant from where we are today that maybe the people in the audience would be interested in it. And that is, the desert is a place of austere spirituality.
Heavens, I haven't been able to spend enough time in the desert in such a long time. But I'm going to this year, damn it. I got to the desert by going to the Actions Against Nuclear Testing at the Nevada test site starting in 1988. My God, 22 years ago. I'm ancient. Although everyone out there seems, I suspect.
Not as old as I am, I'm sorry.
That's, Philip, we are in complete agreement about that. I knew we'd come to a complete agreement about something.
No problem.
But it was really interesting, because you kind of have to learn to look at the desert, and if you have sort of standard Eurocentric landscape aesthetics, you see what's not there. You see that it's kind of scrubby and stark, and that it's not very lush, and the kind of beauties, the color green. There's a wonderful anthology about Nevada called "Getting Over the Color Green," and but it's a theater of light and space and silence that, like nothing else. There's a beautiful Islamic saying, God made the desert so there was some place he could walk in peace. And, and I kind of fell in love with the desert, with that austerity and that spaciousness and that incredible light where the landscape looks so different. There's this, if you look at it at midday, it's this kind of flat, stark square. I'm thinking of the landscape around the Nevada test site, which is 60 miles north of Las Vegas, the landscape where we tested more than 1,000 nuclear bombs, or rather detonated more than 1,000 nuclear bombs and called them tests. And, but in the morning and the evening, the magic hour, as photographers call it, the beginning and the end of the day, the place is, luminous and golden and fiery. And there's these deep shadows stretching for dozens of miles from the mountains. At all times, you can see 100 miles off on a clear day. You can see 100 miles without if the space is open. You have that kind of wonderful blue of distance. You have this incredible. The sky is always doing something. The life that you kind of have on the ground in temperate places, you have on the sky, where the light is changing and storms come in. You have the monsoon season you have across the Southwest. You don't have here. So, and there's a kind of spirituality in that. I think you feel very vulnerable and very mortal. You could die of thirst. The distances are often too far to walk across. So you become aware of your own smallness, which I think is often, in a day where human beings seem so big and overpowering, they've changed the climate, to experience your own smallness, I find often very redemptive. And between that and the light and the silence, that for me that's a lot of the spirituality of the desert, as well as some of the rich traditions of the people who've been there and love the place and have a kind of culture where they're incredibly rich in stories and songs, and that's wealth rather than having a lot of stuff. The Shoshone Indians I got very close to, and the activist work I described in Savage Dreams, the Eastern Nevada people traditionally burnt somebody's property after they died to specifically prevent the accumulation of wealth and inheritance and things like that. And so it's really about not owning a lot, about a kind of almost Franciscan tradition of keeping materiality at bay, so that you live, and if you're not material, then what are you? Maybe you're spiritual.
A Field Guide to Getting Lost. This is my favorite of all your books. I think primarily because I feel it. It has a great truth that I can understand, and it's one of your simpler books.
Really?
And it has a great deal of you in it, and has a great deal of people who illustrate what you're writing about. And that is, in the beginning, you leave the door open for the unknown, the door into the dark. And in this way, you get lost, and then you may be fortunate to find yourself. This is not so much a question as a comment on that book. The end is one of the most powerful endings of a book I've ever read, and one of the most puzzling, and yet one of the most understandable. And in the last couple of paragraphs, you bring in your father, who worked for the Marin County Planning Department, and the last paragraph has two parts to it. You mentioned all he did to write the 1973 Marin County General Plan, which lowered the level of development and all the criticism he got for it, but all the good that he did by doing that. And the second part of the paragraph is he comes home and he spots a sour glass of chocolate milk on the dining room table, and he thinks you left it there, although you didn't, and he takes that glass into your bedroom and throws that sour milk into your face, and the book ends. Of course, it's very powerful, and what it does to the reader, what it does to this reader, is I felt lost. I don't need to know why that happened, and certainly you're not going to explain why that happened, but what you did, and this is what I think is the genius in the whole book, but ends on this high note, or low note, whichever you want to look at the end, is you really conveyed to me that feeling of being lost, and it was the feeling that counted. It wasn't that I found my way out of that particular conundrum, but you put me into that state where you wanted to. So that's a comment, and you may or may not want to comment on it.
Well, I will, in a roundabout way. Well, I should say that my father was kind of an angry, violent person. It's partly, Jewish pogrom, weird history, etc., and partly personal stuff. But actually, this goes back to my fabulous Mesa Refuge residence. So Peter Barnes out there, thank you. There was a book there by a Dr. Martin, does anybody remember his name, who wrote about the preservation of Marin County, the activist who preserved it? Marty Griffith. And I was reading it at Mesa Refuge, and suddenly there's this reference to my father being at all these terrible meetings where the developers were constantly attacking him and his fellow planner. And my father wrote the master plan that preserved a lot of West Marin, which I'm very proud of. He was a very good planner. He wasn't such a great parent. And it's really a redemptive chapter. It's called One Story House. It's about at the end of the book. And I should also say that glass of chocolate milk comes at the very end. The book opens with me drinking a glass of Passover wine meant for Elijah, so when I'm 8 years old. So it sort of begins and ends with this kind of, drinking or glasses of stuff in the family. And, I grew up in Novato, by the way, so, which is what kept me perennially so uncool. But,
you sure mastered that.
What?
You mastered being uncool.
Yeah, well, but it was, I suddenly realized that incident with the chocolate milk, which was sort of an extreme version of, but not so unusual. My father hated waste, and I was the chocolate milk drinker usually, and so I sort of threw this chocolate milk in my face as I was sleeping, was that he was coming home all wound up from one of those meetings. And when I realized, two things happened at Mesa Refuge. I found that reference and realized that it was after one of those meetings that this had happened. And then I realized that I'd spent, that I was out of that one-story house, the house in Novato, and I'd been out of it for a long time. The chapter begins with this kind of wonderful dream that really ended the psychic sense of being stuck in that house in which all those bad things had happened. But I'm still in the landscape he preserved. And so it's really about a sense of proportion that, Marin with the elephant seals and the tule elk and the quail and the hills and the... all these species is very large, and the house was very small. So it's kind of gaining a sense of proportion and putting the childhood in perspective of my father's impact, which was also all this preserved space. So it's really a chapter about redemption and forgiveness in some way. But the other thing that happened at Mesa Refuge is Us residents got sent out on a little nature tour with Rich Stallcup at the Point Reyes Bird Observatory, and he didn't realize that this was the story he was telling, but that's also the fall that I got hopeful. I wrote a book called Hope in the Dark, speaking of swimming against the current of left thought. As the war broke out and all that despair broke out, I thought that, somebody needed to try and redeem a sense of possibility and power and hope, and so I wrote that book. But a lot of what made me hopeful was going back to Yosemite. In Savage Dreams, I'd written about the nuclear wars that weren't supposed to begin yet, and Indian wars that were supposed to be over, that were going on simultaneously in the early 90s. I went back early in the 21st century and found that a lot of what had the stuff around the Indian wars had changed. That a lot of the cultural wars about the role of Native Americans in the landscape, their right to be there, how they would be represented by all these public things, monuments, national parks, education, the way we observe Columbus Day, had radically changed, which is where I got really hopeful about the power of culture to make politics that matters. And then Rich Stallcup kept saying, we were walking around and he was going like, oh yeah, those are white-tailed kites, they almost got extinct but they came back. There's a peregrine falcon, they almost went extinct but they came back. Because of DDT, these brown pelicans almost went extinct but then they came back. Here's the tule elk, there's elephant seals. And I realize that the environmental narrative we mostly tell is about what we've lost, but that because of changes we've made, a lot about not killing every damn thing that moves, the way that ranchers used to shoot eagles and poison coyotes and just, shoot everything recreationally, and a lot of stuff like that. The fact that we stopped killing whales and elephant seals for their blubber. A lot of species have come back, that not all environmental stories are despairing. And so that chapter was, it makes perfect sense if you have 7,000 words. It's not going to make sense in, the 5 minutes I'm giving it, but it has a lot of those elements, and so it's really a chapter about redemption. And the redemption of my father, for me, in a sense, was realizing that a lot of this landscape in some way was his doing, and that's a much bigger space I still inhabit than that lousy little split-level ranch style, which I was truly out of at last.
Well, speaking of birds...
I wasn't lost in that chapter at all.
I wasn't lost. I experienced the feeling of being lost, which I thought was what you're trying to get at. And in case you weren't, I appreciate the fact that you got me there. But speaking of birds and wildlife, I was out rowing on the bay this morning, which I always do almost every Sunday morning, and I stopped at Shell Beach and laid out in the sun, and the big motorboat pulls up. A huge family gets out, and this guy gets out and says, did you see the bald eagle? And I didn't. I was so damn mad that someone in a motorboat had seen it, and I hadn't seen it in a rowboat. But there's a bald eagle out on that bay, which might be a follow-up to what Rich Stallcup saw. So one question on River of Shadows, Edward Muybridge, and the technological Wild West, and then we'll move on to questions.
Okay.
Could you talk to us about Muybridge and speed, meaning the motion studies that he conducted for Leland Stanford, which led to movies, which led to Silicon Valley?
Yeah, I wrote a book called Wanderlust, A History of Walking, which was partly about moving through the world at 3 miles an hour, about walking in particular in all acts of slowness as a kind of resistance in the spirit that factory workers stage slowdown strikes against an accelerated world. And with a lot of my books, I get to the end of them and I feel like I've answered one set of questions and raised another one. I had talked a little bit about the birth of the railroad, which was the first really fast thing on Earth, the first time we were truly moving at the speed of machines beyond the speed of nature. Horses push hard can go about 10 miles an hour for a distance, and you can go a little bit faster on something super light like the Pony Express, but like riding Stagecoach or something, it took 6 weeks to get from New York to San Francisco. The railroad changed that to 1 week, which was this incredible acceleration. People were going, 30 to 60 miles an hour. And but I was really interested in the disembodiment of everyday life, this kind of living in a world where human bodies are no longer the measure of all things. Man is not the measure of all things. We live in a world that's as small as an atom, as big as an atomic explosion, as fast as the speed of electricity, if not light, at which we send signals, in which we're moving faster than, I just flew up here from LA today. If I'd walked, I'd be getting here in late May. If I'd driven, I would have, even driving at 70 miles an hour would have taken a lot longer. I think I must have gone about 500 miles an hour. And That's such a transformation of consciousness and experience of the scale of the Earth. But it was really interesting. I had this hunch that Edward Muybridge was this great point of intersection for so much of what I was interested in. He was born the year the first passenger railroads ran in England. He was born in England, came to San Francisco as a bookseller in 1855. And so Muybridge's patron was Leland Stanford, who built the Transcontinental Railroad, which made it possible to go around the world in 80 days and go around the world kind of casually instead of having these incredibly rugged adventures. They'd shrank the globe colossally, the railroads and steamboats. And Muybridge set himself the task at Stanford's behest of speeding up photography from these kind of exposures of several seconds to several minutes it took, which is why everything you see in the old photographs is still people sit for their portraits. They even have these things to hold your neck so that your head wouldn't wobble. And you have these wonderful portraits where the children are blurry because they fidget, because they can't sit still that long, that I love. And Muybridge succeeded in creating cameras with the help of Stanford's engineers and speeding up the technology of photographic chemistry to be able to photograph things in motion, the movements of a horse's legs at a fast trot or a gallop, and to make visible a world that had never been seen before, what water looks like as you throw a bucket of, and it would take 6 frames for a bucket full of water to hit the ground in his photographs. He was getting these, 1/500th of a second exposures or 1/100th of a second. And you put a sequence of those together and project them, and you've got the beginning of motion pictures, and so it's not only a world of acceleration, but a world of living in images and information that had begun with these earlier technologies and was being accelerated with the telephone, with cinema, with the internal combustion engine, and then with airplanes and things, which is sort of the second half of these two bunches of acceleration. So Muybridge was my wonderful core sample through all these changes. And for me, the fact that he was photographing the Indian Wars, that he was in the West, and things like that was also really interesting. For example, as he was inventing this technology that would become cinema, he was photographing the Modoc War, the biggest Indian war in California history, which was a war to refuse to be assimilated into industrial culture. And I realized doing the research on this book that in many ways was the most delightful of all my books, the one that felt like magic, like it wrote itself, that the Modocs were dancing the ghost dances. They fought this war, that they chose to take on all white society because of the ghost dance, which was a technology too. It was a technology to make time run backwards so that the white people would disappear and all the animals and the dead native people would come back, which is also about a cinematic control of time. And it felt very moving and profound to see this technology that really didn't work, but these other fantasies about controlling time that had come upon these people. So Muybridge was connected to so many stories about the resistance to this industrialization and displacement that our era has been about, and the creation of that era by these new technologies, the way that railroads and machines and photographs and images and speed were all used. But the speed itself, the speed that's faster than thoughtfulness, that's faster than the ability to relate, I think is the very essence of our time. And this was a pivotal moment that I wanted to talk about.
Wonderful.